Boom. Blessings and much love to everyone. My name is, as you would already know, my name is Zin, and I am the master trainer at the International Institute of Hematology, the headmaster mentor. And this is the debut of our formal induction into Christ. Right? As some of you may already know, this induction in particular is the first of its kind. I've spoken about it over our radio shows as well as over our respective podcasts. This is the first induction of its kind where we are now, for the very first time, being able to take our lot more than 40,000 hours of pragmatic and experimental research into the ancient Hebrew principle of the scriptures and compact it into an induction for the body of Christ internationally. Right? One of the things in particular that we have not had within the body of Christ, and this is just to give you some background information and some background story with regards to the formation of this induction. One of the things that we have not had within our Greco-Roman influenced Christian community, or for the community, is an induction. Right? Now, most of us in particular, may have learned about Christ through the lens of a traditional education, and some of us may have actually also been familiar with Christ through a knowledge of his historicity. Right? And because of that, what we have had is a very informal understanding of what Christ is. This is not something that was normal before the beginning of the Westernized Christian community and the Westernized Christian movement and era or civilization. Before the Westernized community began, everyone that you're reading about in the Bible belonged to a covenant that gave them a very formal knowledge of what was expected of them. And not only was there the written Torah, there was also the oral Torah, where the information was written, but there was a lot of oral information that was actually passed down to the adherents of the covenant. Within our Westernized Christian community, we have not had any knowledge of Christ via covenant or through that means. And so what we have had within our Westernized Christian community is a very loose understanding of Christ, a very informal understanding. And there's been no understanding of what you're getting into, what are the parameters, what is the dimension that you're stepping into, what does that will look like. This again is something that was known it was very much known and was cultural knowledge to the persons that you're reading about in the scriptures, in the Bible, in the New Testament as well as in the Old Testament, Old Covenant saints, New Covenant saints. This is something that was common knowledge to them. And we have assumed that what is common knowledge to us in our Westernized Christian community is the same knowledge that they would have had, and that has actually led to lots of confusion. Right? So this is the very first of its kind formal induction into the covenant of Christ, where we now take all of the tens of thousands of hours of pragmatic and experimental research regarding the covenant of Christ, regarding Christ, regarding the spiritual paradigm, the panorama, the spiritual world that the Bible exists in. Not only that which is seen, but the unseen realm. What does that look like? What does that frame look like to be able to know what we're getting involved in? We've been actually able to put it into a very brief understanding of what it means to be in a covenant. Right? The whole idea of the induction actually came about because most of us in particular, if you've sought employment, if you've had a job at any point in time in your life, and even if you still have a job, You would know that when you go to a company, when you go to seek employment, one of the very first things that you are introduced to is an orientation or an induction, right? And in this induction, what is really covered in this induction is where this company would have been if the company has been around for 50, 100 years and more. There is information that is actually communicated in this induction, identifying where they were, what they used to be, where they are now, what their objectives, and what is the vision for the future, as well as what are your responsibilities and how you can actually contribute towards the growth, development, and the direction that this company is going in. And within the Westernized Christian community, we have not had that. Right? Most of us come into the traditional understanding of Christ or the study of Christ via his historicity, and we say that we believe in Jesus, but what we say, what we refer to as believing in Jesus, and what the authors of the text mean when they say that they believe in Jesus is not the same. And so this is probably for the very first time, because we have not heard anybody in particular has been able to put these things together, but we have successfully been able to do so at the International Institute of Pneumatology. And so, welcome to the debut of the formal induction into the Covenant of Christ. All right. So, for centuries, the subject of Christ has been traditionally communicated from a religious perspective, grounded by its own compass of morality. This has led to a modern Christian community that has been using the name of Christ Jesus to no avail, resulting in the fruits of death mentally, emotionally, and physically. As a result, the Bible containing these holy scriptures that has been miraculously preserved over thousands of years, accumulatively, is now ridiculed, derided, and invalidated as having no practical purpose. It has been called a lie. The Zane Caricature International Institute of Pneumatology is not going to change this. Research that gave birth to the Institute was started with one main objective, which was to answer the question, is the Bible true? And if so, why isn't it working mechanically today? With over 40,000 hours of pragmatic and experimental research into the ancient Hebrew principle of the ancient sacred texts and the energetic mechanics of spirit, we have not only proven the Bible to be true in its respective context, but have inadvertently identified that the perspectives of Westernized Christianity have been heavily misguided. As a result, there is now an all-time record of 3,000 denominations statistically. This means we live in an era where there are 3,000 interpretations of the sacred texts. This induction is purposed for the first time in over 2,000 years, or even 1,900 years, to give insight into the lost context of the scriptures as it relates to the overall message of the Bible. We will make clear the covenantal viewpoint of the sacred texts as intended by the prophets, the Messiah, and apostles respectively, who authored them. We'll reveal its respective worlds as well as where we fit in the overall story. We will also give insight into how to formally fulfill the terms of the covenant that is available to us today and enter into its spiritual realm. This induction will eliminate any and all confusion regarding the purpose and the utility of the Bible. Now, if you have not known who we are from before, we are Anointed Life. Right? Anointed Life is a branch of the Zane Caricature International Institute of Pneumatology that serves the body of Christ internationally. The Zane Caricature International Institute of Pneumatology is a non-profit, non-denominational institute dedicated to pragmatic and experimental research of the ancient Hebrew principle of the scriptures and the energetic mechanics of spirit. Our research has revealed that the ancient Hebrew principle of biblical literature is the name of God. And through the psychology of the name, we teach the scriptures as well as reorientate every aspect of life into the functionality of the tree of life for sustained power, wealth, wisdom, health, delight, and life. In this induction, we are actually going to be covering a few things. The first, the learning outcomes here, would be the name and the spiritual rules of the Bible. We will give insight into the birth of the name and the three worlds of the Bible that are also identified as the three gardens or the three heavens. We will identify each model and how they practically work. The second is the timelines and objectives of the gardens. We will take a look at the timeline of the three gardens and what the objectives of the gardens are. We will also identify the garden that we are in now, its purpose and objectives. This will also provide clarity for daily living in the Spirit. And covenantal orientation. We will take a mechanical look at the covenants of the first, second, and third gardens and how the respective covenants highlight how the spiritual realms of the respective model works. The covenants serve as the law of manifestation specific to the garden that it belongs to. So in this induction is categorized into phases. This induction that you're listening to right now is merely phase 1. Right? Phase 1 is the phase where we'll introduce you to the name and the garden story of the Bible. And yes, there is a garden story of the Bible. Phase 2, which will be the succeeding phase of this induction, not today, we will take a look at the spiritual worlds and how those spiritual worlds work. Phase 3, we will cover the objective of the gardens. The garden in particular has a purpose, an objective, and a vision. We will break that down for you so that you can understand what you're involved in. Phase 4 is where we will zone in on your covenant, understanding what your covenant is and what your covenantal requirements are. Right? And how to practically engage that covenant in this generation. That covenant is very simple. It's a 2-phase covenant. The education of the covenant really come in where we need to actually bring you your mind and your understanding of the concepts of that covenant to synchronize it with the concepts and the understanding of Yeshua himself, his apostles, and all the prophets and priests of the Old Testament. Once we do that, understanding and synchronizing the concept that they had with your concept, or synchronizing those concepts, you'll become clear as to how to work out your covenant. But all it requires is a really simple education as to what you are involved in. And phase 5 would be the phase where we identify as anointed life the education that we can provide you with regards to your covenant and everything else that we are presenting here in this induction. So let's go into phase 1. All right, in phase 1, we call it phase 1.1. We will take a look at some primary misconceptions in your scriptures. We will also define the Bible. You need to know what the Bible is. We take a look at the micro and macro lens of biblical literature. What is that? Because most of us in particular are very much taught the microscopic lens of the scriptures. And because of that, we lose the context of the scriptures. This is no different from standing, I heard someone in particular use this analogy. There is a difference between standing 6 inches from an elephant and watching its leg and not knowing, just knowing that this is a leg. It might, and if you never saw an elephant before, you're standing 6 inches from its leg, the only thing that you would see would be the color of its skin, the hair that it has on its skin, and that's all. But if you stand 15 feet away, then you see the context of the entire elephant, what the entire elephant looks like. And then do you get context to the part that you were staring at? Most of us in our Westernized Christian community have been taught to view the Bible like the person standing 6 inches away from the elephant's leg. And so we give great priority to what we are seeing. But at no point in time have we been taught to back away and take a look at the panoramic view of the scriptures so that you understand what you are involved in and what is the context of what you have been looking at microscopically. We'll also take a look at the garden story of the Bible. Right? Again, because of the microscopic lens, we have been viewing components of the scriptures, and we have given great, we have been giving what we have been taught to view in the scriptures priority. And these few components of the scriptural narratives and components of the Bible that has been given priority, these components that have been given priority, has given birth to denominations. A denomination is basically birthed or basically formed when one component of the Bible is given priority over the rest of the Bible. And so the founders the founders of the various denominations are no different from persons that may have been standing. One may have been standing close to the elephant's leg, hind leg. Another may have been standing close to the elephant's front leg. Another standing in front of the elephant's stomach. Another standing in front of the elephant's trunk. Another standing watching the elephant's ear, 6 inches from the ear, literally 6 inches. And what has happened is that these persons have ended up trying to define what they've been looking at, or rather trying to define the elephant based on the one part that they're looking at. They have attempted to define the elephant based on the one part that they are looking at. And so because of that, there began movements, religious beliefs that were born as a result of giving priority to one aspect of the elephant and not standing 15 feet away and watching the entire elephant to find context to the one part that they may have been staring at for so long, a mere 6 inches away from the elephant. Right? So if you stand back from the Bible, there is a garden story of the Bible. This garden perspective of the Bible is something that the priests of the Old Testament knew, the prophets knew. They constantly refer to the garden. Yeshua was a rabbi of the garden, and I dare say a master rabbi of the garden, and his apostles were also master rabbis, because they would have actually been interfacing with Christ's restoration of this garden. And of course, the last thing I'm going to take a look at is the literary logic of the text that you are watching at. Most of us have been taught to read the text via our Greco-Roman mindset, which is a system of logic called step logic. The Bible is not written in step logic. It's written in block logic, but we will get to that when we arrive. But the first thing in particular that we would like to highlight in this induction is, as we said, the primary misconceptions concerning the Bible. Most of us have been taught the Bible is God's divine law to which all mankind is responsible. I'm sure as you hear this, it resonates that this is God's divine law, and this is God's law for everyone on the face of the earth. This is the first misconception that we definitely need to unhinge and to get out of the room. The Bible is actually the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. It's actually a series of narratives that you're provided with regarding persons that were in divine contracts with God. All right? Again, the Bible is actually a series of narratives relating on regarding groups of people that were in contract, in a covenant with God. This means that every single person that you are reading about in Scripture, especially the nation of Israel, the apostles who were disciples, the prophets, the priests, everyone in the Bible are mentioned in the Bible because they were persons who were in covenant with God. The nation of Israel, from which we claim the blessings of the Pentateuch or Deuteronomy, which is also known as the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, that belonged to people that were in contract with God. Therefore, if a contract in particular comes with covenantal criteria and benefits, which we call blessings, the only way to access those blessings would be to engage the respective contracts or the respective covenants. That means that outside of covenant, no person that is outside of the covenants of the Bible is responsible to the Bible or is responsible to the benefits or the criteria of the covenants of the Bible. Now, I know this in particular is a concept that we have been taught, has been inculcated to us. But no unbeliever, someone who is not in the new covenant, is responsible to the Bible. Therefore, it is disrespectful to tell anyone that has not made a conscientious decision to enter the covenants of the Bible that they are wrong or that they are in sin or against God. This is simply not true. Right? The Bible is an accumulation of narratives of persons who were in contract with God. And therefore, to share the covenantal promises, one must be in a covenant. For verification of this, you can take a look at Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, that clearly said, that Paul said that to the circumcised community, those who were in the covenants, the uncircumcised community, those who were not in the covenant, were outside of the covenants of promise, in the world without hope and without God. They had no covenantal connection. Right? So what is the Bible? The Bible, rooted in ancient civilizations, is a book of functional divine covenants and the narratives of the peoples who entered into those covenants. Today, this is the same. The Bible is specific and is relevant to only those who have entered into the respective covenants. The truth is that covenants and contracts are one and the same. And contracts are mechanisms that one enters into by satisfying the terms and conditions. No one is responsible to contract unless they have formally entered into it. Now you're on the micro and macro lens of the Bible. Most of the Westernized Christian world is familiar with a microscopic lens of the ancient sacred texts. From this perspective, as we mentioned, many denominations have been birthed through the prioritization of subjectively chosen components of the text as its reference point or as its center point. And what that simply means, as we just mentioned, I'm going to change the analogy and use a house. There's a difference between standing 6 inches from a wall outside of a house and watching one brick. There's a difference between watching one brick 6 inches away from the brick, where you can see the grains of the brick, the dust on the brick, the formation of the brick, and stepping 15 to 20 feet back and watching the entire structure that is called the house. When you watch the entire structure, then the brick finds context, or rather, you find context for the brick. And one of the things that has happened over the last 2,000 years of Christianity, of Westernized Christianity, or Greco-Roman influenced Christianity, is that we have had many instances where persons who may have been reading the Bible saw one particular component of the text magnified and made that mole a mountain, and began to view the entire context of the Bible through that one component. And there we have had the birth of now 3,000 denominations. This means, statistically, we have had 3,000 components of the text that persons have watched, magnified, and attempted to define the entire text through that one component. And each one of those components would be the priority of one of these of each of these 3,000 denominations. That means that a denomination is simply a group of people that is defining the Bible and defining Christ, God, and everything that we think we know about spirituality through that one component of the scriptures. From a macroscopic lens, the great story that the biblical literature is communicating emerges. And that is the garden story of the Bible. And that brings us to Genesis chapter 1, or the garden narrative of the Bible. In the beginning. In our Westernized culture, we have assumed that the narrative of the Garden of Eden communicates the creation of the cosmos. We have assumed that this was all done in 7 days and that it was a one-time event. Unfortunately, this has been a perspective that has been surmised independent of the thought heritage of the ancient Hebrews paradigm. There are, in fact, 3 gardens in the Bible. The first garden is actually the garden narrative that we are all familiar with, which is Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Right? These 3 gardens in particular had 3 different founders bearing the same name, Yahweh Elohim, 3 different time frames, and they all, the last 2 perished by different methods or different means, whilst the last one is still existent today. The Garden of Eden or the gardens in the Bible is also known and referred to by the authors of the texts as heaven. The garden also gives context to the biblical, to the spiritual context of a world. And the Garden of Eden is in fact synonymously referred to as heaven and earth. So if you've seen the word heaven in the Bible, it's referring to the Garden of Eden. If you see the word world in the Bible, it's referring to the Garden of Eden, all right, or one of these three gardens. And if you hear the term heaven and earth, that's a couplet, a parallelism, heaven also known as earth, that is another term that refers to the garden. Right? Therefore, it is at this point that we must actually explain that the Garden of Eden of Genesis chapter 1 and 2 was not about the creation of the cosmos. The Garden of Eden is in fact designed to explain in the form of a narrative, or to present in the form of a narrative, how the spiritual construct and hierarchy of that particular era functioned, and how one was actually going to be interfacing with it. I know some of us, I'm looking at this, is actually going to be hearing this for the first time, because you've been taught, well, there's the Garden of Eden, and heaven is in the sky, earth is right where we live, and hell is beneath us. This is a paradigm that is strictly Greco-Roman influenced, or rather, it was incorporated by the Greco-Roman world, but the context of heaven and earth, as we have been taught in our Westernized Christianity, was actually birthed in Persia, whilst Israel in particular went through their captivity after Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem and marched Israelites, or Judeans rather, back to Babylon. Not long after that, the kingdom of Persia, or the Persian Empire rather, they actually gained control of the city of Babylon. After Persia came the Macedonian Empire, which is known as the Greeks. Right? That was actually headed by Alexander the Great. And in Persia, there was the nation of Israel. They were led into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar, and there in captivity, they no longer had possession of their scriptures, or the Torah. And so all of everything that was related to the practice of what we know today as Judaism was actually left in Jerusalem amongst the rubble after the destruction of that temple. And when Persia came in under the governance of Cyrus the Great, the same person that is actually known as the anointed one of God by the prophets. And whilst in Persia, Israel came into contact with a lot of their folklores as well as their mythologies. And one of the religions that they came into contact with in Persia is actually known today as Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism, they believe, it is their belief that they thought to do that which is morally right, and they thought to do that which is morally wrong or evil, to do what is morally good and to do what is morally evil, is actually birthed from two gods that are rival gods. And these two gods are always in war with each other. They are from two gods from two separate kingdoms. One is the kingdom of light, and the other is the kingdom of darkness. When Israel, while Israel was in Persia, historically, it is actually indicated that the leaders at that time, in an attempt to keep Israel from wandering off into idolatry, and to keep them from abandoning what they had been taught and what they would have passed down in the kingdom whilst Persia maintained world power. What the leaders decided to do was to incorporate their folklores as well as the mythologies of Persia into into the knowledge of the Israelites, with the intention of giving it a God twist, a Yahweh twist. These perspectives were not meant to be passed down as doctrines. They were just the leaders' way of taking in what they were exposed to give it a Yahweh twist, because it was very, very fascinating. The mythologies, the folklores, an attempt to maintain control of the people and what they were getting involved in. They incorporated these mythologies and gave them a Yahweh twist. That was passed down from one generation to the next, even while Jesus was present. And eventually, that came into the hands that came into the knowledge of the Romans. And in the Greco-Roman world, that was then incorporated into the scriptures and taught as doctrine. Prior to Israel coming into contact with Persia, there is no mention of Satan as an opposing god, or demonic realm, or demonic kingdom. Right? The context of Satan in the Bible prior to Persia was simply that which is opposite of what God created it to be. It was merely a title that can be placed on man, creation, things, or even happenings that are actually that are actually functioning in a nature that was opposite from what God designed it to be. Right? The first creature in the Bible to have received the title Satan was the serpent, because the serpent communicated an idea that was contrary to what was communicated to the Adam. All right? So having explained that, there are 3 gardens in the Bible. The first garden is the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 1. That garden in particular, the man that was created in that garden was called Yahweh Elohim Adam. Right? This is the garden narrative of Genesis 1 and 2. That garden narrative, that garden, or the era of that garden, perished by water. The second garden in particular is in fact because of man's decision in the first garden that actually caused him to reverse his function from functioning from his spirit towards the creation, and not using the creation as his reference point, as his wisdom. When he fell out of the garden, by reversing his function, he was no longer able to reproduce the garden. Because according to the ancient Hebrews, the man in the garden, Yahweh Elohim, was the firstborn of creation, which is where Jesus, in identification with the man in that garden, is also identified as the firstborn of creation. And Yahweh Elohim Adam was then the creator of heaven and earth. Because of his decision, he reversed the function of the garden, not functioning from his spirit towards the creation, but from the creation, but using the creation as his wisdom. Man was no longer able to reproduce heaven and earth. And so the second garden is the garden of the temple, or the tabernacle that was founded by Moses. Right? Moses is represented in the scriptures as being given the title of the man in the garden, Yahweh Elohim, and he is seen as going back to the serpent that took man captive outside of the garden, and commanding the serpent to let the garden people go, let Israel go. Israel represented the garden nation. Commanding to let them go, took them back from the serpent, and proceeded to build a physical model of the garden, which was actually called the tabernacle. That later became the temple in Jerusalem, and the prophets of the scriptures referred to the temple in Jerusalem as the garden and Jerusalem as Eden. Right? This in particular would be why Yeshua was born in that second garden, and he is seen as healing the sick, raising the dead, and casting out devils. He is seen as the man, as the Adam of that garden, coming back in the spirit of Yahweh Elohim Moses, and cleaning up the garden, whilst the leaders, the Pharisees, who sat in the seat of Moses, representing the Adam of that garden, they were corrupt, and therefore Eden, which is supposed to be the place of delight, the Garden of Eden, which is supposed to be the garden of life, was filled with death and sicknesses and diseases. Right? That garden was destroyed in 70 AD and perished by fire. And the third garden is the garden that the garden that is now called the New Jerusalem. Right? The first of this garden is actually now Yeshua. After the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, according to Revelation 21, the new heaven and earth was installed, and Yeshua is the Adam of this garden. He is the firstborn of creation, and in identifying with the same name that Moses and the Adam of the garden identified with, he is actually identified to be the first and the last. The first, the one at the beginning in Genesis, and the one that is the Adam of the last garden, which is the third garden, that is known as the garden or the world without end. All right, so in this context, Jesus, in the identity of Yahweh, is the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Is this making sense, everyone? All right, if this is making sense, just type sense. So now story time. So the following is not meant to be a detailed recount of the narrative of the gardens, but merely a general overview. All right. Before we can actually take a look at the story in and of itself, and to understand the story, we also need to identify the literary logic of the text. Through the Greco-Roman system of logic, we have approached the narrative of the Garden of Eden through step logic. And that is, step logic is simply a chronological sequence of thinking. In other words, in step logic, the logic that we are taught in our Greco-Roman influenced literature is sequential logic. That means that we only understand what we are reading if it is actually written in a chronological sequence. A sequence where one thing comes after the other. If we interrupt the chronological sequence, the narrative no longer makes sense to us. The narrative of the Bible, narrative of the garden, and the entire Bible is actually written in a system of logic that is called block logic. And in block logic is simply parallel sequences of thoughts arranged by order of priorities. Parallel sequences of thoughts arranged by order of priorities. Chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis were not meant to be read in chronological sequence or in step logic. It was actually meant to be read in parallel sequences, and that actually constitutes block logic. Right? We will explain this as we move along. Right? In contrast to the westernized system of logic that places the creation of the Adam on the sixth day of creation, the Hebraic system of logic places the creation of the Adam as the first act of Elohim. Now, for us to understand this, the first thing that we actually have to actually come into an understanding of is that we have been taught to read the Genesis narrative in this step logic or in this chronological sequence. That means that we read from chapter 1 into chapter 2 into chapter 3. And what we're looking for is chronological sequence to gain some context as to what we're reading. As the Bible is written into block logic, there are different stages of block logic. All right, block logic comes in parallelisms in words, parallelisms in phrases, parallelisms in verses, and even in chapters and excerpts. So, having said that, one of the best and very first mentions of heaven and earth in the Bible, which is Genesis chapter 1, reveals the presence of block logic, which is parallelism. In this in particular, we have been taught through step logic or chronological sequence that heaven and earth are two things. And that's because we understand the word "and" to be somewhat of a conjunction or an aggregate. In the context of heaven and earth in Genesis chapter 1, that's a parallel sequence, or that's a couplet, right, which is a parallelism. If you grab any concordance and go to your Bible right now and take a look at the word "and" between heaven and earth, you will see that the word "and" there is the translator's insertion into the text to identify that heaven and earth is a parallelism. The word that is translated "and" means namely or even, which means in literal translation of that text, it will read, "In the beginning, Elohim created the heaven, namely the earth." Or, "In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens, namely even the earth." Right? The entire narrative is actually a very complex sequence of parallelisms that we must be familiarized with in order to read the text and understand it as it is. Now, having said that, it must be known, it would be beneficial to know that Genesis chapter 1 and 2 are not meant to be read in step logic or in chronological sequence, but Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, verse 3 is actually a parallel excerpt to Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 to the end of Genesis chapter 2, which means they are parallel chapters. That means that in that system of logic, when God says, "Let there be light," the parallel to that is God breathing the breath of life into the dust. It is for this reason in the Bible that we see Jesus saying that, John, not Jesus, John, in John's gospel, he quotes Jesus as saying that he is the light of life. He is the light of the breath of life. There's also the same reason that John, in his first 5 verses of his gospel, says, "In him was life, and the life was the light of men." Because in that logic of the scriptures, the light and the breath of life are one and the same. What further demonstrates this in the Bible? What further demonstrates this in the Bible is that whilst Jesus was on the cross, representing the Adam of the garden, when he exhales the breath from the body on the cross, the garden goes back to darkness. Right? That is because light and the breath of life are one and the same. From this particular perspective, just to start right there, we can clearly conclude just by that first component that our entire westernized construct and our understanding of the scriptures is heavily misguided. We've been reading it wrong, not by any fault of any particular individual, but by the system of logic that we have grown up in and the system of logic that we have been taught. Our system of logic is specific to our westernized civilization. Outside of our westernized civilization, our system of logic does not apply to other cultures. All right? So in the context of the garden, breath, life. Jesus exhales. I said blows. He blows upon the disciples, but he exhales the breath from the body. When the breath entered the body, that was light. He exhales it from the body, and we go back to darkness. All right. It is also the reason why when Yeshua resurrects, they go back to the tomb and they see men dressed in light, because the breath, those two men are referred to as angels, but they were actually symbolic scriptural representations or scriptural symbolism of Yeshua being the first of the garden, and therefore those two quote-unquote angels represent humanity, just as there were two men on the cross that were crucified with him. Because of the two men on the cross next to him, Paul in his letter says that humanity was crucified with him. When he resurrects, you see two men in the tomb dressed in robes of white light, meaning that now that the breath of life is now the breath of life, or the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Elohim, is rebreathed into Yeshua, humanity now has the breath of life. So in contrast to the westernized system of logic that places the creation of Adam on the sixth day of creation, the Hebraic system of logic places the creation of the Adam as the first act of Elohim. Therefore, Genesis chapter 1 to chapter 2 verse 3 reveals the thoughts of God, which is the speeches, the ceremonial speeches of the garden. And chapter 2 verse 4 to the end of the chapter reveals the ceremonial acts of the garden. So in chapter 2 verse 4 to the end of the chapter, we see how the man actually manifests or creates heaven and earth and all that is in it. Right? This is actually paralleled in the scriptures by Moses, who receives 7 speeches of God and a Sabbath, and then which is God's word to Moses, Moses being the Adam of that garden, of the tabernacle, which is referred to as the Garden of Eden by the prophets, and Moses himself. And then after the 7 acts, 7 speeches, and a Sabbath, you had 7 acts of God through Moses, or Moses in the name of God, and then a rest. This is also paralleled by King Solomon, that had 7 speeches, and then he had seven feasts, right, in celebration of the temple. That was just the formalized structure of the garden. Right? What we have been taught in Genesis chapter 1 as the creation of man on the 6th day is not the creation of man, but the reproduction of man. And before man could reproduce in the garden, because in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26, it refers to man and woman, and before man could reproduce after the kind of Yahweh Elohim, the conversation with the serpent interjects. He finds himself outside of the garden, and therefore you see Genesis chapter 5 saying that God created man in his own image and likeness, but Adam reproduced according to his own image and likeness. Right? Through Yeshua, we who come into the knowledge of the name would be actually the fulfillment of Genesis chapter 1 verse 26. Is that making sense so far? Is everybody following that? Makes sense? All right. Therefore, the Adam in the garden is the firstborn of all creation. And just as Yeshua in particular is the son of Elohim, and he takes on the name of the Father, his father's name, just like the man in the garden, he and the Adam in the garden are seen as the same person because of the same name. In our westernized English, we call it species, same species. Right? So the story of the scripture goes, in the beginning, Yahweh Elohim, which is Father, breathed the breath of life into the dust, creating Yahweh Elohim Adam. This is written in Genesis chapter 2, but you can only discern it by reading its parallelisms. Right? In creating Yahweh Elohim Adam, he is called a living, physical Yahweh Elohim Adam, or a living, physical Yahweh Elohim. Yahweh Elohim Adam created heaven and earth, also known as the Garden of Eden, over which he presided as a priest king. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In the garden, the name of the breath is Yahweh Elohim, whilst the name of the body is the title Adam. This is the first mention of the name of God being given to the Adam in the scriptures. The name defines 7 things about the man. The name was to him his principle of functionality, as his designation, his title, his function, which is of course reflected in what we will call mindset or logic, his nature. It defined how the nature of his spirit worked. It defined him as a species. It defined his essence, which is mainly seen as his light signature throughout the scriptures. And it is also the name that defines the realm that was meant to be his mental realm, which is what we know as heaven. This was the original name of the species of man, Yahweh Elohim Adam. Shortly after, a conversation takes place where man makes a decision to listen to the opinion of the serpent. Taking on the thoughts of the serpent as his own. In doing so, man changed his name. Adam made the serpent his Elohim and father. Right? Now, when we say father, the context of father to the ancient Hebrews is the originator of a particular thought, or the originator of a particular mindset. So Adam made the serpent his Elohim by prioritizing, by giving priority to the serpent, and therefore by listening to the words of the serpent and taking action on it, he made the serpent his father and switched his function from identifying with his own spirit to identifying with creation as his substitute spirit, using it for his wisdom. In the garden perspective, the wisdom of a creature is determined by the nature of its spirit. I want to say this again. The wisdom of a creature is determined by the nature of its spirit. Therefore, the nature of the spirit is supposed to determine and influence and have determination over the mindset of that particular creature. Therefore, the breath of God being breathed into the dust, resulting in a living Yahweh Elohim Adam, that the Adam was therefore meant to live from his own spirit and to use the thoughts of his spirit, the nature of his spirit, as his wisdom. In the conversation with the serpent influenced him to abandon his spirit as his wisdom and use a tree as his wisdom, which is why you notice in the narrative it says that it was supposed to make one wise. In other words, Adam broke covenant with God, not God in the sky, but the breath of God in him. He broke covenant with his own spirit and used the spirit of a creation, something that he created, as his wisdom. Because of that, at the Institute, we say that he began to identify with creation as his substitute spirit, using it for his wisdom. The decision changed his identity and also caused him to reap a different atmosphere. Living from his spirit as his wisdom, he reproduced the spiritual atmosphere of what we call heaven or paradise. This is actually also known as the Garden of Eden. When he changed his source of wisdom and used a creation outside of his spirit. He used another creation, something that he created. He did two things. One, by using another creation, as his wisdom, that becomes the priority of his mindset, and therefore he creates a different atmosphere. And secondly, in the garden narrative, there are only two categories of beings: the creator and the creation. The creation proceeded and was birthed from the creator, and the creator here would be Yahweh Elohim Adam, right? With his father Yahweh Elohim, right? His father and son, Yahweh Elohim with Yahweh Elohim. This, of course, is reflected in John's extrapolation of what Jesus taught him by saying, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Right? That is because this is actually Elohim with Elohim. This is also reflected in the order of Melchizedek. The order of Melchizedek is identifying as God with God. So he changed his identity, and when changing identity, he chooses a different priority, and he could not reproduce the realm of his own spirit. He began a realm based on creation. Now, because of the two categories, creator and creation, when he was functioning from his own spirit, he was told to cultivate and to keep the creation by making this by choosing a tree from the creation that proceeded from him as his new wisdom. We in our mindset, in our westernized culture and traditions, we see it as just a tree. But in the context of the scriptures, this is not a tree. It is the entire category to which the tree belongs. So when he used the tree as his wisdom, instead of he cultivating and keeping creation, he began to use the whole category of creation to cultivate and to keep him. That meant he was no longer a generator of thought to fill the thought with creation. He was using the creation as his source of thoughts. And therefore, he was now functioning like a helper in the garden, which is a receiver of thoughts. Right? This is the entire human conundrum, and that which Yeshua came to rectify. Right? And the last thing that he did in doing this was that he pretty much in the context of breath and dust as also two categories. If he was not functioning from his breath, then he had to identify a physical creation. And if he is identifying physical creation, then he's actually watching dust, no longer seeing the spirit in the creation, but identifying it by its dust. Right? And therefore, in doing so, in the garden, he reaped his atmosphere was, the atmosphere of his spirit was dust. The atmosphere of his spirit was the garden. Sorry, I'm just tying up my words here. The atmosphere of his own spirit was the Garden of Eden, which is what we call the New Jerusalem. In the second category, where he chooses a creation, he's no longer identifying with his spirit. He's identifying the physicality of the tree. He's now identifying with dust. And therefore, in choosing that as his priority, he reaped a desert. Right? Simply put, function from your spirit, reproduce garden. Use external reference point for wisdom, you're using dust, and you are going to reproduce an atmosphere of dust, toil, death, and mental health issues. All right, so this decision changes identity and also caused him to reap a different atmosphere. Man was no longer living in the garden due to his new reference point. His new awareness caused him to live in the desert. His name from this point on was no longer that of the spirit or breath. The name of the spirit was Yahweh Elohim, because he no longer lived from the priority of the spirit as his wisdom. Instead, the name of the body became his title, because he gave priority to the senses of his physical body to locate external sources of wisdom. In doing so, He changed his name from Yahweh Elohim, and the title Adam was what stuck to him. And it was pronounced over him that dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Reaping his new awareness, this began the desert civilization fathered by the serpent. This decision was a reversal of the spiritual function of man, making the serpent his Lord and Father. Right? The serpent happened to be a helper. He was created amongst the helpers of Genesis chapter 2. And if the serpent was a helper, using the serpent as a reference point, making the serpent his father, meant that he would now function after his own kind. So if the serpent was a helper, then the Adam would function like a helper, and therefore he is no longer functioning as a generator of thoughts, but he's depending on everything outside of him to give him thoughts. He's now a receiver of thoughts. The name of God that he carried in the garden identified him as a self-existent and eternal authority and power, making him a generator of thoughts. His decision that caused him to find himself outside of the garden made him the opposite, which is codependent and temporal, hence death, subservient or victim-like, and powerless. The codependent identity makes him a receiver of thoughts. This dysfunction is what the prophet Moses categorized in his covenant, in the law code, as sin. All sin is simply a legal term to define being codependent, temporal, subservient, and powerless. Being a receiver of thoughts and pursuing your wisdom externally. All right, this is the story of the first God. Fast forward to Abraham and Moses. A few chapters later in the book of Genesis, God communicates with Abraham and makes a covenant with him. He communicates to Abraham a blessing that summarizes the intention of the first Garden of Eden. That is to make a mighty nation of priests, or Yahweh Elohim, on the earth. Fast forward to, a few generations later, the blessing of Abraham begins to be executed through Moses and Aaron. God sends Moses with his prophet Aaron back to the serpent king. Pharaoh in the desert was symbolic of the serpent that caused the man to make the decision to find himself in the desert, as well as the serpent that became the Elohim, the authority over man. So just as the serpent was said, on your belly you shall crawl, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life, so Pharaoh is represented by the prophets in the scriptures as the serpent who created a civilization from his captives. And Moses and Aaron, and Moses in particular, is seen as the Adam, taking on the name Yahweh Elohim and going back to the serpent, commanding the serpent to let go of the garden people. The title Israel actually is defined as the ones who rule like Elohim. In other words, civilized garden nation. God sends Moses with his prophet Aaron back to the serpent king to command the serpent to release the garden people that he took captive, which is alluding to Genesis chapter 3. As I just said, Israel is a title that means the ones who rule like Elohim, and thus representative of the garden people. Moses with his prophet humbled the serpent king and successfully fulfills their charge to take the garden people, Israel, the ones who rule like Elohim, back from the serpent in the desert, take them out of the dust. From there, commence a journey from the desert back to the promised land, which is physically representative of the garden again. But for the garden people to return to the spiritual atmosphere of the garden, they must circumcise, symbolic of the cutting off of the skin they were clothed with in the desert, Genesis chapter 3 again. That skin that they were clothed with in the desert is what the Apostle Paul calls flesh. I want to say that again. That skin that they were clothed with in the desert, the Apostle Paul, in speaking to the Gentiles, he refers to it as living in the flesh. Right? So the cutting, they must circumcise, symbolic of the cutting off of the skin they were clothed with in the desert, taking on the name Yahweh as their own with the guidance of the Torah. In the context of the scriptures, what you are clothed with in the context of the scriptures is symbolic of the mindset that you have taken on as your own. Just as the first garden was created by Yahweh Adam, so the physical model of the garden was created by Yahweh Moses. Since the dysfunction of man's spirit did not permit the spiritual garden to shine from their hearts. This physical garden with Israel, the garden nation, with many ups and downs and a spiral into corruption, continued until the coming of the Messiah. The Messiah was expected to save the garden people from death by reaping death on their behalf and reinstalling in them the incorruptible breath of life. Yeshua, who is the Messiah, was seen as God's breath breathed into dust again, which is what you see with Mary, a descendant of Adam. Adam is entitled dust by God in Genesis chapter 3. Therefore, the dust reproduced, and Mary is a descendant of dust, and therefore she's identified as dust. In the context of the scriptures, God's spirit coming upon Mary is God breathing the breath of life into dust again. All right, so he is seen as God's breath breathing into dust again, cleaning up the sickness and death in Jerusalem. But he does so via the covenant. Now, one of the things in particular, as a side note that we must take into consideration here, is that our understanding of the covenant of Moses is also heavily misguided. We have been taught that the covenant is, and that is why we refer to the Ten Commandments and all of the things of the law that we should do, because we believe that by keeping that, God will respond to us from the sky and bless us. But that was not the Mosaic Covenant. The Mosaic Covenant was two-layered or phased into two categories. The first level, the first phase, was keeping 613 commandments. You can say that the Torah of Moses, or the covenant of Moses, the law of Moses, the Torah of Yahweh, was actually a covenant that was designed to restore the adherents back to the garden. What it's designed to do is that the first phase of the covenant, was designed to stop man from doing the things that the man in the garden wouldn't do. This is the side of the covenant that translators translated as the commandments. 613 commandments are like 613 things that the man in the garden wouldn't do. Because the first phase of the commandments was actually given to the man outside of the garden. When to come into the covenant, you need to physically circumcise. The physical circumcision of the man, who is responsible for the fall of the species, which is why the man alone was circumcised, not the woman. The physical circumcision of the man meant the cutting off of the skin that he was clothed with outside of the garden. He was clothed with the skin of an animal because the animal were helpers, and the helpers were receivers of thoughts. They were supposed to receive thought from the man and execute the thought as they received it. To come into the covenant, you need to physically circumcise. These were steps as a proselyte. If you and I, or those of you listening to this right now, are supposed to come back into the covenant, to come back into the garden, or let's make it a little more interesting, you were back in ancient Israel and you wanted to become part of Israel, the first thing that you'd have to do as a proselyte, which is a convert, is to physically circumcise. That meant cutting off of the skin that the man in the garden was clothed with. The clothing of the skin outside of the garden represented the mindset that he took on, which was a helper mindset. That means that he was a receiver of thoughts. And therefore pursuing his validation externally, pursuing his wisdom externally, listening to people and things to tell him what to do. That's his wisdom. You're supposed to physically circumcise, which means we're symbolic of cutting off that mindset. And right after that, you'd be ceremonially washed. This was actually then mirrored by John as baptism. In our culture, we know it as baptism because we see the word baptism. The word baptize means to be submerged in water. But what is not taught in our Westernized Christian community is that baptism also means to change your name or to give someone a name. In ancient Israel, you would actually go and be submerged in water and be ceremonially washed after your physical circumcision. And the water was represented as a womb. When you submerge yourself into that water, you arise. And when submerging into the water was a symbolic representation of being born into the world again, anew. And in this case, you would leave all of your life, your family, your friends, everything of your pre-existing life just disappeared, and you emerged from the womb into life again, and you emerged using the Torah as your life's lens. That means that you started with 613 things that a man in the garden wouldn't do, and once you keep the commandments, the Torah would upgrade you to priest, which means that you step back into the garden atmosphere after qualifying yourself by not doing the things that the man in the garden wouldn't do. This is actually seen in Exodus 19. It upgraded you to priest, which is why God told Israel, you keep the commandments, you become a kingdom of priests. Kingdom of priests means that you're back in the garden, because Adam and Eve, the man and the woman, are actually identified in the Hebraic text as priests in the garden. Yeshua was born under this covenant, kept the commandments, and when John baptized him in the Jordan River, that was Yeshua upgrading to the second phase of the covenant. He kept it as a normal man and upgraded, just like everybody from the Old Testament. He was born without power, living just like a normal man. Kept the first phase, and the covenant upgraded him to priest. He was baptized, given his father's name to be baptized, to be given a name. He's given his father's name, and he walks into the wilderness to relive Israel's 40 years in the wilderness via the 40 days, and then walks out of the wilderness in power as a normal man, taking on the father's name via the covenant of Moses and cleaning up the physical month of the garden from all death. All right, so after 3.5 years, 3.5 years, the Messiah then preached judgment to the elected and corrupted Moses of the garden, which were the high priests. He preached that fire would proceed out of Elohim and consume all knowledge of good and evil from the garden. This is what we have misinterpreted in our Westernized Christian community as hell. Simply that the fire that would actually consume Jerusalem, which was Eden, and burn the temple to the ground, which was representative of the garden, is the same fire that was seen in Genesis chapter 3. The fire that stood between the Adam and re-entering the garden. And what the fire represented, the fire is actually termed in the New Testament as the consuming fire. What it simply meant was for man to come back into the garden in Genesis chapter 3, his knowledge of good and evil, which is his external reference points of living, must be consumed. This is why Moses, in particular, after building the tabernacle, wrote the book of Leviticus. Why was the book of Leviticus written? Or how did it come about? The book of Leviticus was born to deal with the same conundrum that the man faced in the garden that Israel and Moses faced. Just like the man in the garden who began to use external reference points, and the fire stood between him and the garden. For him to re-enter the garden, his knowledge of good and evil had to be consumed. After Moses built the physical mound of the garden, Israel could not enter it either. And so the book of Leviticus is born, where there are sacrifices of fire, which is the consumption of the knowledge of good and evil, so that they can come back into the garden. And so because fire is the element of this garden to consume the knowledge of good and evil, the physical mound of the garden, it was only fitting that fire will consume the garden when it is corrupted. So Israel stepped away from the covenant, its leaders, and so Yeshua prophesied that fire would proceed from God and consume the garden and consume all in the garden with the knowledge of good and evil, and that had defiled the garden with the knowledge of good and evil. This was fulfilled in 70 AD. Only those who held faithful to God's name would be saved from the garden cleansing fire, and those would be the disciples of Yeshua, who took on the name that he walked by, and they were not consumed. Right? Nice. So the concept of hellfire was not only specific to the destruction of all knowledge of good and evil, but was also specific to the second model of the garden, the temple in Jerusalem. This was directed to the corrupt covenantal inhabitants of the garden and no one else, aka the circumcised. After the second model of the garden was destroyed in 70 AD, the third garden was installed. This garden is called the New Jerusalem. Yeshua is the firstborn of this garden, advanced to the form of a city. This is the garden that we exist in today. How was that story? How was story time? All right, this is the story of the second garden. All right, fast forward to Yeshua. Christ's crucifixion took place before the installment of the third garden of the world. This is one of the contexts being referred to by the statement, the Lamb was slain before the foundations of the world. The destruction of the second garden, that is the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, or 70 Common Era, CE, which is what it is termed today, ushered in the installment of the third garden, making all inhabitants, believers, priests, or sons of God. All right, this brings us to phase 1.2. What is the name and why is it important? Now, if you've actually listened to anything that we have said so far, you'd realize that the name of God is actually a very, very primary component of the scriptures. As a matter of fact, you can actually term the Bible the Holy Bible of the name, right? Or the scriptures of the name, the storyline of God's name amongst men who choose their own name. Yahweh Elohim is the name of God and the name of the breath of life that was breathed into the Adam. The name defines everything that one needs to know about God and everything that one needs to know about the Adam and Yeshua the Messiah. The name is the one that both Moses and Yeshua spoke in. Yeshua called this name, Yahweh Elohim, he called it his father's name, implying that as a son, he is a reproduction after his father's kind, or a reproduction of his father, of the name of his father. The name is the name in which Yeshua lived in and discipled in. It's the only system of discipleship that exists in the scriptures, both Old Testament and New Testament. As a matter of fact, discipleship in the name is what Old Testament prophets and priests, as well as Yeshua and his apostles, did to fulfill Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, that says, "Let us make man according to our own image and according to our likeness." It is according to the image of the name and the likeness of the name. The discipleship system, both in the Old Testament, I'm reiterating, the discipleship system, both of the Old Testament and the New Testament, was a discipleship system of the name and a fulfillment of Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Let us create Adam, or man, according to our own image and likeness, is the same thing as saying according to the image and likeness of our name, Yahweh Elohim. Therefore, all believers in Christ Jesus has inherited this name. Everyone that exists on the face of the earth is breathing this name, this breath. But not everyone is living from the breath as their source. In the Garden of Eden, the prophet Hosea said that the Adam in the garden broke covenant with God. And how did he break covenant with God? He broke covenant with God, not with God in the sky. The abandonment of his spirit as his source of wisdom and using a substitute source of wisdom, which is a substitute spirit, or being double-spirited, which is also called double-minded, was him breaking covenant with God. The breath of God in him was God. And in doing so, he broke covenant with God. In this new covenant, most people, everybody here on the earth, all of humanity, with Yeshua being the firstborn in identification with this garden and the one in the first garden, everyone here is therefore seen, according to the writer of Hebrews, as the seed of Yeshua. And therefore, everybody on the earth has Yahweh Elohim's breath, Yeshua's breath. This is why Paul's message was to the Gentiles, Christ is in you, the hope of glory. Christ in you, the hope of glory. He did not preach Christ will be in you when you confess, when you say that Jesus is Lord. His message was Christ in you. And this is why the prophet, the apostle Paul also said that we are enemies with God in our minds. Because everybody is living by external reference points of wisdom. And the believers are those who believe that we have the new breath of life, and which is the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God in us. And our discipleship in Christ is to now reframe our mindset from using external reference points of validation to beginning to use the Spirit of God inside of you as your wisdom. Be self-existent again, eternal, authority, and power. All right? This name, the meanings of the name are actually principles of function. And therefore, we must, what we are accustomed to outside of this understanding is a codependent logic, where we're using external things for validation to define ourselves. We are living temporally, we are dying because of our codependency. We are living subservient to external priorities to define ourselves, and therefore we are living powerlessly. Coming back to Christ means that you come back to self, to come back to living as Yahweh Elohim as your name that defines your function, your mindset, and your logic, the way you think. You have a self-existent logic, system of logic, or self-existent process of reasoning, which is eternal, and you function as an authority, which is functioning in power. Right? The name is the name that defines everything that the believers need to know about God, about Yeshua, the Holy Spirit, and themselves. All of these here are one spirit. The name is much more than a label or designation. It is a title that defines function, defines the mindset that you're supposed to be living by. It defines the logic that you're supposed to be living from. It defines your nature, the nature of your spirit, and how your spirit produces how your spirit produces vitality. It defines your essence, the light signature of your spirit, and the covenantal realm that your mind is designed to be held responsible to, which is heaven. Without understanding this name and what it means in these categories, a believer who is also a disciple of Jesus is lost. It is the name that one takes on as their own at baptism into Christ. To be baptized means to change your name or to be given a name. The name is the principle of all life. Because man was the firstborn of creation, and therefore Yahweh Elohim Adam created heaven and earth, he reproduced Yahweh Elohim in all creation. Therefore, to understand creation, one must understand the name. It defines the psychology of God, of Elohim. It defines the mind, the psychology of the mind of Christ. The name defines the energetic nature of the Spirit, who we call the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost, and the spiritual, the heart posture that the believer has made an oath to live in. The name translates the self-existent and eternal authority and power. It is the name that defines the believer's mind renewal to the supernatural. Taking on the mindset or the logic of the name is taking on the supernatural mindset or the supernatural logic of Elohim. Before becoming a believer, everyone lives from the opposite of this definition. That is codependent and temporal, victim-like, and powerless. The realm of heaven, which is another synonym in the Bible for the Garden of Eden, is defined, and how it works is defined by Yahweh Elohim, the name as a principle of function. Right? This name is the name that is the contractual identity of the believer who comes into the new covenant. We will speak about the covenant in phase 3 of this induction. Tonight, what we did was cover phase 1. Right? This is when you come into the covenant, you're supposed to take on Christ Yeshua's name as your own, as a priest. And therefore, Yahweh Elohim, Yeshua, is your contractual identity. Just like if you're renting a place, if you're renting an apartment, you have landlord and tenant. That's your contractual identity. When you come into the covenant, your covenantal identity is Yeshua, Yahweh Elohim, Yeshua the Christ. Is this making sense? So tonight we covered, just as we said, we covered the gardens of the scriptures. We covered the garden story, the garden narrative, and we also covered the name. All right, count the cost. This isn't kindergarten Christianity. I'm not watching the messages. Whoa, I have a lot of comments here. Wait, sorry. All right, so any questions or feedback? All right, this is the first presentation of this presentation. I started off with a particular tone in this presentation because I wanted to just record it one time after the first presentation of it. But then I realized if I just kept the reading of the text and just give short definitions, then the listeners, wouldn't really benefit from what this presentation is designed to explain. So I just decided I will not use it for that. We'll use this as presentation for discussion. Right? Hence the elaborations. So at this point, I'll encourage any feedback at all from any feedback. Isn't there more than one salvation? Actually, there is one salvation that takes on various contexts, if that makes sense. All right? There's one salvation that takes on various contexts. Right? Salvation is simply, Jesus is referred to as salvation. This is not explained also. Through the lens of the garden, salvation is the breath of life being restored into man, saving them from death. This concept is then translated into the old garden, the physical model of the garden, as salvation being not going to hell, which is not being burnt when the fire proceeds from God and consumes the entire garden in Jerusalem. It is also but that was the context. The principle of that concept applied to the second garden, the second garden that it was preached in, right? Which is why it was told of those in Jerusalem in the Gospels, those who believe in me will be saved, and those who don't believe will be condemned, right? Because salvation is really the restoration of life, being saved from death. So because of that principle, it was applied to the garden, to the second garden, and that means not being burnt with Jerusalem and the temple when the fire comes, as it did in 70 AD. And so those who believed in Jesus' name received his escape instructions, his evacuation instructions, and they left. They left Jerusalem, symbolically walking out of that garden and they walked straight into the new garden after destruction of that garden, right? Which is the world that they were waiting to come, which is this temple, this garden that we're living in here right now. Right, so I just want to shout out those who join us here today. Jimmy Heck Shook. No volume yet, though. Okay. Induction time. Let's go. Holy Sister Patty. Holy Sister Anu Mitha. Keturah Bartholomew. Donald Davis. Hannah Leota Johnson. T.D. Straw. Holy Brother Donald Davis. Blessings and much love. Daniel David Osipinski. Now seeing you here, bro. So that's huge. Let there be light. He blew the breath of life. That's not as Woody Watch so far. I love saying one. It takes a lot for me to feel like I'm hearing things but I appreciate that, bro. Humbled by that. I'm very humbled by that. This is a synopsis. I started off a little there, right? Just giving some even shorter definitions, but I thought it wouldn't benefit everybody if I did that. And when I'm doing recording for the website, that'll be a different thing. Right. Let's see who else here. Did I miss anybody? All right, here as it does TD's Rick Wood, blessings and much love, holy brother. Tanya Woodkey, blessings and much love, holy sister. I think that's everybody there, right? Rick says, I'm meant to be trimming trees this morning. I started listening to good stuff. I'll do it after lunch. All right, so this is phase one of this induction. Here are a few questions that I would like you all, the listeners, to respond to in the comments now, please. You kindly do me this favor. Was this induction insightful considering the garden panorama of the scriptures? Was this induction insightful considering the garden panorama of the scriptures? Just indicate in the comment section for me, please. All right, just about 2 or 3 more questions. The second question is, in listening to this induction here today and seeing the garden panorama of the scriptures, the garden story of the scriptures, did it help you see the big difference between what the scriptures is designed to communicate in comparison to what you have heard all of your life? Right? In comparison to what you were taught, did this induction so far help you draw a clear differentiation between what you were taught and what the scriptures are actually designed to communicate through the ancient Hebrews? through the lens of the ancient Hebrews, of course. Deeper insight, yes. Okay. All right. Katura says, yes, it was. Donald says, indeed, very. Rick says, yes, very informative. Simple to understand. Deeper insight, yes. Nice. Third question. Is this, it's very deep and insightful. Okay. Third question. Is the information that we covered here today, even though pretty much at the half point of the presentation is when I started to really unpack things, the information covered here today give you a clear enough picture as to what the Bible is about, as well as what you are involved in. Question number 4. Did anything here not make sense? Number 4 is, did anything here not make sense? And my last question is, what in particular is your main takeaway from being introduced to the scriptures through this lens? No ambiguities. Okay. Right. What is your main takeaway? Right. I want to thank each and every one of you whilst you're writing that for commenting here and contributing to this present and contributing to the session. This is phase 1. Phase 2 and phase 3 are not as long as phase 1. Phase 1 is really where we really had to ground we really had to lay the groundwork so that phase 2 and phase 3 could actually exist on the foundation of phase 1. I also saw in this presentation tonight that I had to explain certain things that I may need to include in the presentation. Main take away the gardens. Okay, great. Anybody else? What are your main takeaways? Everybody, please, as much as you could. What are your main takeaways? All right. Kajira says the Bible is a book of functional divine covenants and narratives of those who entered it. All right. Donald says almost like a GPS navigation beyond time parameters. What? That is a nice explanation. Give me that. I might borrow that. I might borrow that. I hope you don't mind if I borrow that, bro. All right. No ambiguities. We don't need a fourth garden. No, we do not. Main take away the gardens. Right. Rick says, thanks, Brother Zin, and makes me want to go out and function in your name in everything I do. Awesome. Right. Major takeaway, the meanings of the name and the principles of function. The meanings of the name are principles of function. To actually experience the garden, you have to understand the name and its function. Otherwise, you're merely looking at garden from a distance. That's true. We have everything we need in us. Yes, we do. Borrow away. All right, brother. Right? All right, Daniel says, great message. The river of life. All right. So this then is the end of phase 1. I will next week most likely next week, Sunday, I'll do phase 2. The Sunday after that, I'll do phase 3, and then phase 4 and 5. Phase 4 and 5 will pretty much go hand in hand. Right? So I trust that phase 1 in particular has given you enough to think about. The 3 gardens. Let me ask one question. One more question, and I would encourage everyone. I'm requesting everyone to respond, please. Is this presentation simple? Is this presentation simple? All right, the recording will be in the group. Four more phases. Woohoo! All right, the recording will be left in this group, Holy Brother, so you can access it. All right, everybody, please respond to this question. Is this presentation simple? All right, the objective here is to simplify this information so that any and everybody can read this presentation and realize what the Bible is about. So is this presentation simple? I need everybody responding to that, please. All right. This presentation in particular is designed to be a self-paced presentation. So this will be available on our site. I'm going to do over this session, of course, putting in some of the information that I mentioned here today that I didn't think it was necessary, but I realized that it is. So I will actually do that for the phases coming up. All right, phase 2 is completed already. Just stand up there waiting. I'm in the middle of phase 3, and phase 4 and 5 would be very easy. So this is almost finished, and it will be available for all. Right? This will be a self-paced presentation, and I will do a professional recording through each phase. I didn't need my dictionary this time. Yeah, brother, I try. I try to keep it as simple as possible. All right. So this will be available in the group, of course, so you can review it. And if you think this is actually going to be beneficial to anybody else, I would encourage you to share it. This will also be available on our YouTube channel. It's live on our YouTube channel right now, so you can also share it from the YouTube channel. All right. So I'd like to thank each and every one of you for your participation here tonight. Before we go, I just want to also indicate that we have begun 2 Facebook pages for our radio shows. There's some announcements before we go. Number 1 would be the Facebook pages for our radio shows, so that you can, if you have not received an invitation already, please search for Happy O'Clock live radio show on Facebook, and you will see the Facebook page. Follow that page. The Holy Sister Patty will be streaming her episodes on that page also. So if you want to follow Happy O'Clock, you want the notifications, you're a fan of Happy O'Clock. Happy O'Clock is actually a radio show that is specifically designed to interview and highlight some of the most astounding and jaw-dropping miracles and healings, as well as to provide healing. Right? They cover testimonies as well as inspirational excerpts from the scriptures and interviews with persons who have had experiences with regards to healing and miracles in their lives. Right? The prophet Joshua was told by Elohim, by God, to daily visit the wondrous works of Yahweh for success. And this is what Happy O'Clock is designed to do. So if you would like to follow Happy O'Clock, please search, if you have not received an invitation as yet, please search Happy O'Clock live radio show and follow Happy O'Clock Live Radio Show. The second page that we have created is Reboot Your Biblical Perspective Live Radio Talk Show. If you want to follow your radio show, search Facebook for Happy O'Clock Live Radio. Sorry, not Happy O'Clock. Reboot Your Biblical Perspective Live Radio Talk Show, and follow that page also. Right? I've been trying to invite others, but because probably I spent some time inviting everybody for Happy O'Clock yesterday, Facebook must be kind of telling me to take our time out from adding more people. So I have not been able to send out invitations via Rebooting Biblical Perspective Radio Talk shows yet. But if you would like to follow that, you're going to have access to links so that you can listen to the previous episodes and so on. All right. You'll also have links on those pages because we're actually going to be taking all of the episodes and making it a podcast. So if you would like to access the podcast of that, to access that on your podcast channel, follow those pages. We provide you the links when the library of the episodes are uploaded as podcasts, right? As podcast episodes. That's number one. Number two, I am going to be starting a Facebook page as a master mentor of the Institute for myself. All right. Most likely, this is not something I've discussed with the master mentors as yet, but I realize that having a Facebook page in particular is beneficial. So I'm going to start a Facebook page for myself where I'll be disseminating information because we realize that the Facebook groups are being limited by Facebook and Facebook pages are apparently picking up pace. So please look out and stay tuned for links for my Facebook page where I will be taking all of this ancient biblical pneumatology and speaking about it there, having conversations and making that available to the public. And lastly, if you would like to have more one-on-one contact with me for questions, coaching, and so on, you can always search. You can always find me on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Zane_EL_Fuego. Search for me on Patreon where you have access to 2 podcasts that are members only podcasts. Reboot Your Biblical Perspective educational podcasts, where we teach you how to read the Bible through the lens of the ancient Hebrews. Read it through the garden. It's the same garden we're speaking about here. Understanding the scriptures through the lens of the garden is what brings you back into the garden and brings you back into power. All right. So find me if you like one-on-one coaching. You want to get involved in group coaching. We have group coaching programs that are running monthly. Right now, we have a year-long life coaching program that is actually running, where every month, where we address 12 areas of life and renew those 12 areas of life, reorientate those 12 areas of life to the name, so you can actually have a relationship via the logic of the name. Once you actually learn the name, every aspect of life must be redefined, and it has to be redefined so that you can function in the divine space, have your relationship and marriage in the garden atmosphere, your family and your friends, garden atmosphere, your home, your career, your everything about you, your identity, your spirituality, how you interface and communicate with others, bringing it back into the garden. So we have programs that we run there on Patreon. If you are interested, please find me at www.patreon.com/Zane_El_Fuego. All right, so this is the end of the first phase of the induction into the covenant of Christ. If you have any suggestions that you would like to make, I'll encourage you to leave them in the comment section. We will take them into advisement, take them under advisement, and we will incorporate what can be incorporated into the presentation. Stay tuned next week Sunday for phase 2 of the induction, where things get a little more detailed with regards to the garden and the function of the garden. Right? Because most persons are not aware that these 3 gardens were the templates of the spiritual realm that function within that particular era. All right. So next week we will be speaking about that and how the spiritual realm works and how this spiritual realm works, because many of us are trying to actually tap into the dynamics of the old spiritual realm and not this new spiritual realm, and how this new spiritual realm works. And that's why the church is so powerless. So stay tuned next week, Sunday. And for Rick, brother, happy cutting, happy trimming. I know it's bright and sunny in Australia right now if you're going outside to trim. Right now it's 10 o'clock at night here. So we ain't trimming no trees right now. So blessings and much love to everyone. Thank you again. And stay tuned. Boom is all Yeshua. Body of Yeshua. Ra.